Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We'll get started here momentarily. Thank you for joining us today. We've got a lot of folks joining today, so I want to make sure that we give them a chance to join before we get started. All right. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Alex Kron. I am BPOC's Digital Operations and Collections Information Analyst. Normally with me is Nick Honeysett, our CEO, co-hosting. He'll probably join us shortly. If you're joining us, I said his name and here he is. If you're joining us for the first time, BPOC is a nonprofit consultancy providing IT support services, digital strategy and strategic planning consulting services, and more. We work with clients from all over, inside and outside of the US. Nick and I started this webinar series in 2020 to help facilitate critical conversations around the technologies used in museums, libraries, archives, and galleries, and provide a free resource to the community. Before we get started, I want to mention that we have Zoom captioning available, Otter AI transcription in the upper left-hand corner if you need captions or transcriptions. Please put any questions that you have in the Q&A section. We'll have time for Q&A at the end. And of course, as part of our Dreaming of AI series, we've been building a shared document for AI resources, including policies, guidance, educational resources, learning opportunities, and resources shared by our guest speakers. I'm going to go ahead and add that link into the chat here momentarily. This is a living document that we will continue to update as the Dreaming of AI series continues. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Mark. Today we have Mark Osterman, who will be presenting various case studies demonstrating AI's transformative potential in museum experiences. Mark, thank you so much for coming onto our webinar series. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you for your presentation.
Great. Well, thank you, Alex, and thank you, Nick, for inviting me to be a part of the series, and thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm going to jump right in. I have a lot of content to share, and look forward to a lively discussion and questions at the end. So today I'm going to share some case studies that I've had working with AI that has focused on accessibility and also exploring potentials for collections and exhibitions. Give me one second. So starting off, what I'm going to go through today, I am going to give a brief overview of AI, and that's just sort of really meant to contextualize what we're talking about. I am not a professional with a ton of experience in AI, but I've really thoroughly enjoyed this experience as it's given me an excuse to take a really deep dive and get a better grounding in what AI is. I'm going to talk about various uses of AI in museums, how I've utilized it for visual descriptions, for creating art and exhibitions. Going to share some really cool ideas that I've come across with other museums exploring AI. And then share some challenges, risks, and some very brief reflections before Q&A. So before we start off, I thought I'd actually begin with something more personal to myself that covers how technology and now AI has slipped into some of my own work. And that work is not within technology or what I do in museums, but I'm also a practicing artist. So what you're seeing here, these two images, the one on the left is sort of a traditional collage, and this is how I would create studies for the works I do. And this is over 20 years ago, developing a very basic collage. So using a photocopier from a book from a library, cutting out that this is a statue of a jester or a fool, using a glue stick, putting that together, and I would create collages like that for studies. And so on the right is a painting of mine that I did. I've created this scale just to give a sense, because the collage is something like 8.5 by 11. Those paintings were quite large, something like 4 feet tall, 5 feet wide. As my practice developed and technology seeped in, I stopped using books and magazines to source images and use search engines. And then I stopped creating handmade collages and used photo editing programs or software such as Photoshop to develop digital collages for these studies. So on the left, you can see one of these digital collages. Sometimes those would be works of art on their own, and sometimes utilized as a study. You can see the painted version on the right. Lately, I've been experimenting with AI at work in the museum, and how could I not explore and experiment with it in my own artwork? So on the left here, using DALL-E, you can see the prompt I used to develop a study. So using the prompt dark figure with hat, umbrella, and cloak in a dark alley, film noir. This is really like a keyword prompt search. The system came up with the image that you can see on the left. I then further edited that actually in Photoshop. I'll break elements down for compositional reasons and for me to better understand if it can translate. But anyway, on the right, you can see the study that I did based on that study. So I'm just going to run through really quick a series of these that I started working on. So again, also just looking at and thinking about the prompts I'm using. In this case, gargoyle smoking a cigarette, black and white, noir, Gothic style. And this is the image on the left that I came up with. And obviously you can see my work on the right. This one, another gargoyle overlooking Paris, black and white, noir, Gothic style. And so I'm using this prompt of noir and Gothic style because it's akin to my own aesthetic. And I typically at this point paint in black and white. But it has been a really interesting process to see these completely newly generated content, these images from AI, and then utilizing them as this source material to translate into paintings. This is the last one I'll share. So another one of a gargoyle. Obviously, I did a gargoyle series, sort of testing out its parameters. And it was just interesting for whatever reason how graphic this one came out in terms of the aesthetic as opposed to the others. So one other project that I want to share is this got me thinking about, well, what are some creative and interesting ways I'm observing and seeing people use AI? And I came across this article on Hyperallergic about this documentary called Eno 2024. So Brian Eno, for those of you who might not be aware, is a very accomplished music producer. He's also an artist, a writer, and a musician. This documentary was recently released, and it's being considered a generative documentary. So the film relies on an algorithmic program that remixes hundreds of hours of interview and archival footage, ensuring that no two showings are ever the same. So a software program called Brian One was developed. So every time this film is screened, it essentially just reorganizes it in some random manner to create this generative documentary. This is also in alignment with some of the aesthetic principles or concepts that Brian Eno is interested in. But again, thinking about AI, not just in the museum world, but how it's sort of seeping into all different types of practices. So let's just jump in. Again, giving a very brief overview and some context about AI. So to begin with, excuse me, thinking about definitions. So of course I asked ChatGPT to give me a definition. In this case, artificial intelligence refers to the simulation of human intelligence in machines that are programmed to think and learn like humans. It encompasses a broad range of technologies and techniques in that mimicking cognitive functions such as learning, problem solving, and decision making. I then recently came across this document that was released in July from the Department of Education, which is called Designing for Education with Artificial Intelligence, an essential guide for developers. And this is the definition used within that guide. So the term artificial intelligence means a machine-based system that can, for a given set of human-defined objectives, make predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing real or virtual environments. AI systems use machine and human-based inputs to perform the following: perceive real and virtual environments, abstract such perceptions into models through analysis in an automated manner, use model inference to formulate options for information or action. And I won't get deep into this because it's really not the focus of what we're talking about today. But for me, it's just interesting here how ChatGPT's definition is really about how AI is the ability to mimic human behavior. And then a human developed definition is really about how we have firm control of AI and we give it parameters for what it's doing. And sort of neither definition is really correct, but I think that dichotomy is something really interesting and something that needs to be figured out and mitigated. And so on the right here, I also came across this goals of AI. And it's not that I fully advocate for or believe these goals are happening, but I did find them aspirational. So that AI can develop problem-solving ability, allow continuous learning, encourage social intelligence, promote creativity, and enable human and AI synergy. The case studies I'll share today are sort of in that realm of promoting creativity and enabling human and AI synergy. So again, I think these goals are aspirational, and it's important to even think about when they're being failed in terms of the application of AI. So I've come across dozens and dozens of schemas for AI. This is one of the most consistent ones that I've seen. So the evolution of AI over time, going through machine learning, deep learning, and generative AI. And again, I won't spend too much time on this. We talked about a definition for AI in general, but machine learning, right? They're advanced algorithms that detect patterns in large data sets. They also, machine learning also relates to natural language processing, which enables computers to understand, interpret, generate human language. It allows us to have things like voice assistants, Siri, Google, chatbots, language translation services, etc. A subsection of machine learning is deep learning, right? So deep learning is inspired by the structure and function of the human brain. It's used for detection, autonomous vehicle navigation, speech recognition, voice control devices. Deep learning powers enhancements in natural language processing. And lastly, generative AI, which has become this big thing and what we'll focus on today, systems like ChatGPT. And experiments that I've been doing are really in this realm of generative AI. It's different because it refers to algorithms that create new content. It can be images, music, text. It tries to mimic human creativity and imagination, differs from other AI techniques such as descriptive models by producing original output. So just to sort of reiterate that, right? Descriptive models summarize patterns in data, while generative models generate new data based on learned patterns. And so, again, we're seeing generative AI be used for text generation, video generation, audio, code, image, and much more. And I'll talk a little bit about some examples I've seen of that in the museum context. So as we all know, AI is filtering into our everyday lives in all sorts of manners. This chart on the right sort of just shows these kind of transferable areas, whether it's customer insight, pricing and promotion, predictive analytics, supply chain, customer experience. AI is being used in all of these areas, and we're starting to see how museums can incorporate AI, not just sort of on the back end, but in other areas such as these being mentioned here. This chart is something I've been exploring with. It's sort of nowhere. I'm just sharing it because it's a thought experiment. So this is adapted for something that I had come across in an article from AAM, but I do like the quadrants that it represents, the collections, patrons, internal, and front-facing. And so as I'm strategically thinking about my new tenure at the Wolfsonian-FIU and projects we may do related to AI, I'm thinking how to leverage them the most and what areas of the museum it'll impact. So obviously you have these quadrants about the areas of impact at the museum. But when I have these overlays, I'm thinking about, well, if I choose a project, how can I leverage it the most and what areas will have the most impact? So if I look at the top left where it's collections management data, I can also be thinking about in the same project translation and image tagging, or in the bottom right quadrant, how enhanced visitor services can relate to chatbot development and something else. So just sort of being strategic and careful in terms of the decisions we're making and choices we're making. So again, this is really a thought experiment, but just thinking about the various case studies. So also arriving at the Wolfsonian, one of the charges I have there is thinking deeply about our existing collections management system and our our non-existent digital assets management system, which we may move into. And so again, through research for this presentation, just digging deep, what are some really interesting or consistent ways that I'm finding museums experimenting with AI related specifically to CMS and dams. And so I won't go through all the detail in here, but automated metadata tagging, improved search and discovery, content management, moderation. The idea of automatic cropping, editing, or format optimization of digital image assets, transcription, and new content generation. And so an example for content generation is part of the case study I'll share, which is developing visual descriptions for works of art in collections at museums. And then on the bottom, also utilizing AI, thinking about the sort of front end of these systems. So when the public has access to our collections, how can we utilize predictive analytics and insights to enhance discoverability for those people interested in exploring who we are? So moving into this case study of some of the experiments I've done with AI, this has really been sort of scrappy experimentation on almost zero to no budget. I've been fortunate enough, my former position at the Low Art Museum and currently at the Wolfsonian-FIU are both institutions that are embedded or part of academic institutions. So there are significant resources that have been able to rely upon, which is knowledge of faculty and students related to these areas, but also just having access to accounts such as Adobe Creative Cloud or Copilot. So that releases any kind of sort of minimal budgetary expenditure I have to make. Anyway, I just want to go through quickly the visual description project, and I'm going to offer some context to this as well, because I know a lot of the participants here are really focused in the tech area of museums. My background is close to 10 years now, a focus on technology, but most of my more than 20 years in museums has been in engagement in museum education. So why do visual descriptions? These are just some of the goals and benefits. So thinking about accessibility and inclusion, it makes objects more accessible to everyone, especially people with disabilities or other limitations. It's a type of enhanced collections access. So becoming part of the data people can access, visual descriptions become part of a more dynamic set of metadata that people might learn about. So going well beyond ideas of just provenance or tombstone label information. The opportunity to slow down. So for people really just to experience the museum, and it doesn't need to be tied to something wholly didactic, but also tied to wellness practices. And it's sort of been well documented how museums can play a role in that arena. Enhance engagement. And for this project, just to be clear, as I run through it, it originated as a human project. So working with volunteers at the museum, and it was really focused for me on co-creation, the opportunity for colleagues, volunteers, museum members, and community members to have a voice in the museum. This is still co-creative as I pivoted to AI, but now it's between a human and an AI system. For those who are unclear what a visual description is, a good definition here, a visual description is a structured and detailed account that conveys the visual elements and characteristics of a person, object, scene, or artwork. It involves describing the visual elements and characteristics such as color, shape, texture, composition, to create a mental picture for the reader or listener. Visual descriptions aim to facilitate access to visual content, enhance comprehension, and promote inclusivity. I just want to make this distinction because people often synonymously use the term alt text and visual descriptions. They are different. So alt text provides brief descriptions of images for screen readers, focusing on conveying essential information like an image's purpose or content in a few words or a short sentence. Detailed visual descriptions offer a more extensive, nuanced description of an image. So you can see on the bottom, I'm not going to read through these, the true difference between alt text and a visual description. And it's mainly based in length and what I've mentioned above, but an important distinction nonetheless. So some of the guidelines that I worked on, and this is training with PAC, so that's Prime Access Consulting. I work with them directly to do training on how to develop visual descriptions. And these were guidelines that we developed through those trainings that were for volunteers. The reason I have these here is I'll read one or two of them, is that for me, these actually work as guidelines as well as working with AI. So when you go through the iterative process of prompts with an AI system, if you're not getting what you need, these guidelines actually help offer constraints to the system to get to that output that you want. So for example, if the system is not being not using accessible word choices, and I'll show a clear example of this, to tell the system to avoid jargon or other kinds of privileged knowledge except where it's essential. So anyway, I'll return to this slide a little later on because as I said, I utilized it once I pivoted to AI. This is just a basic process that we used with volunteers. So there was a 4-hour training for visual descriptions, choosing objects, writing, submitting, peer review process, a museum editorial review, and then how we posted or surfaced or plan to surface these visual descriptions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So these challenges I'm listing here because this was the impetus for pivoting to working with AI. So working through, I originally intended to do about 200 visual descriptions. We got about 75 done in this project over about a 4-month period. And so these were the challenges I ran into. So objectivity, the volunteers were simply challenged by the concept of offering no interpretation. I can't really find an explanation for why this was such an extreme challenge. I just could not, it didn't matter how many times I said this was not a new approach for us in the galleries. It's not how we're doing tours. This is something related and confined to this project. They just couldn't wrap their heads around it and thought it was problematic to offer information that did not have interpretation. They also felt that they needed more expertise to do this work. So that kind of idea of an imposter syndrome. There was a lot of uncomfortability with doing peer reviews. There was definitely wavering levels of commitment to the project. Bias and personal preferences became an issue. Maintaining consistency overall was really hard. This is less of an issue because going back to the original idea, I wanted other voices. So I didn't mind a differentiation in some of the approach, but we didn't want it completely random and all over the place. And trying to monitor that was really a challenge. And then volume, it was just simply difficult to keep obtaining and increasing the amount of visual descriptions. So from this reflection, I decided to start experimenting with AI. And I really thought about AI for this project as something that could complement human expertise in image analysis by offering consistency, speed, scalability, and objectivity. So I'm not enamored with AI, and I certainly think it's highly problematic in many areas of development and experimentation. But this seemed like a really good project from my perspective on what AI can currently do and what it can offer. So utilizing Copilot, I pivoted to AI, but I wanted to think about what I was doing. So this put me down the road of just thinking a bit more deeply about how do you use AI? And so just doing research, again, this is sort of the standards that I came by of types of prompts that you'd see. And it was just interesting for me to see these categories exist. So instructional prompts, reasoning ones, lists, things that are more interactive, keyword, and creative prompts. And in the end, for me, again, just thinking strategically, I like to understand the kinds of prompts I'm using, which have more efficacy and which do not. Most of the prompts I use for these projects end up relating around interactive, keyword, and creative prompts. But for my own practice and how AI is seeping into what I do, I certainly often use the listicle one. I've experienced dealing with reasoning and instructional. So designing prompts, these are just some really good consistent guidelines I come across. Clarity and specificity is important, contextual relevance, using examples and references, being aware of bias and sensitive content that you may be building into a prompt. And then tell it how you want your output to be presented is something really important, especially with the visual description project, in terms of offering constraints, both about length and other types of information you may or may not want. So I will not read through these, but I just listed them here because, again, I found that these guidelines that I developed for working with humans worked very well for this project, working with AI, and was useful specifically for the visual description project. So for me, going through the prompts, usually the first round did not work. So I just wanted to think about a process and, again, some kind of standardization of what I was doing. So I came up with these both based on research, not on my own at all, but these ideas to think about of how I'm iterating the prompts, how I need to offer constraints when necessary, I need to evaluate them, play that role of this synergy between the AI and the human, and also have general oversight. So let's just dive into a few examples of what I had and some of the interesting outputs of the AI system. So at the top of this on the right is a prompt I used. Provide a detailed visual description of this image. This is an image from the Wolfsonian's collection. And I've highlighted some areas that for me are problematic for the guidelines related to visual description. So I've highlighted surreal as that falls into that jargon area that people may or may not know what that means. I've also highlighted where it says evoking vastness and ambiguity. And then also overall, the scene exudes contemplation and solitude. So these are highly subjective statements. They're the kind of things, they're not problematic, but they fall outside the realm of what a visual description should be doing. So at that point, this is what I talk about iterating and offering constraints. So I asked it to now, can you provide another visual description that's completely objective and includes no interpretation? So it did a much better job, but if you notice the last sentence, even though I've clearly stated, don't do this, the system says the overall atmosphere is contemplative and evokes solitude. So it's just a clear example of how these systems are still completely unpredictable and how they will not offer you exactly what you need, and you need to be a completely part of the process and go through many of the sort of suggested steps that I'm offering to really get the outputs that you want. I'm sharing this other example because one of the really effective and surprisingly successful things I got out of AI with this project was how well it was able to create visual descriptions of abstract works of art. So for me, if a picture has a person and buildings in the background and a tree without leaves, those are really sort of basic, easy things to grab hold of and describe through writing. When I'm looking at an abstract work of art, I really had difficulty where to start off from. So I found that the AI system was incredibly useful in giving me the foundation and groundwork to create a visual description of an abstract piece of art. What I also want to share here again is that sort of right now, that endless unpredictability. Why Copilot offered me a detailed visual description as this kind of numbered outline in this case, as opposed to a narrative paragraph in another case, I have no idea. I've used the exact same prompt. So again, being iterative, I then said, can you turn that into a paragraph? And then I've highlighted areas that I, again, found were problematic or questionable for visual descriptions. And again, added, adjusted the prompt for a third iteration. Can you please write this paragraph with complete objectivity and no subjective interpretation? So again, that doesn't mean that you still get the perfect visual description that you want. So even in this case where it says the canvas is covered with abstract patterns that do not represent any specific figures or objects, to me, that's highly subjective and personal, I guess, to the AI system. So that's a type of phrase that I would actually want to remove from a visual description. And again, this is the challenge, right? Because I've said be completely objective, and so the system doesn't fully understand how to do that. So this project, I just want to talk about, some of the ways we tried to surface these visual descriptions. So placing them on the website using QR codes in the galleries, putting visual descriptions as a type of tour and engagement tool in our app, and also including them in our collections management system. So just a few screenshots here. You can see the bottom row, the second from the left, there's a tab that we created. If you were to click on that, you'd come to a page with all this information about visual descriptions. It defines them, talks about why they're beneficial to use in museums, thinking about universal design, not just for accessibility purposes, but how all visitors can benefit from them. And then that webpage also has a series of thumbnails and ways to access visual descriptions. So if you were to click on any of those objects, there's then a page dedicated to that. And the idea is that if someone were to scan the QR code in the galleries, their mobile device would then go to this page. If they're utilizing a screen reader, we're trying to leverage that screen reader to be the accessibility tool for somebody who might have a vision impairment or who is blind. So these are just two examples of what's on the webpage. These are images of what's in the galleries. So the objects that do have visual descriptions that we're experimenting with, we place these QR codes under their labels. The challenge here that I was not able to resolve, and I ended up transitioning to a new position before it was resolved, is how does someone with a vision impairment or who is blind know that there's a QR code there in front of them for this object and it has a visual description? So I have been doing research and consulting with Prime Access Consulting about ideas, and one of them were to have tactile floor elements that someone with a walking cane or a white cane would utilize, that then that would be a prompt to say, oh, this object has some type of accessibility component that would need to be complemented by their experience at the front desk as they enter the museum. But anyway, it didn't fully get there, so it's this this thing that needs to be resolved, and I hope to continue experimentation like this at the Wolfsonian. Also here you're seeing it. This is our, we use Bloomberg Connects app, which I know many institutions are now employing. And so we created a tour that is solely visual descriptions. And again, that gets that idea of universal design. So it's not specifically for someone with a vision impairment. So somebody who wants to slow down, take their time, you know, really dive into the visual aspects of a work of art and get all the details. And so that was an interesting sort of thought experiment, and it added to our roster of tours in ways that someone could engage or explore the museum. And then lastly, I worked with exhibitions and collections at the Low, which utilized TMS. So we had a field created in eMuseum, well, in TMS, that would also obviously be visible in eMuseum, titled Visual Description. So the objects that we had created visual descriptions for are now accessible by the public who are searching the collection through eMuseum. And these are just two examples where you can see a screenshot on the right of the visual description field. So the second case study I'll run through pretty quick here was this AI exhibition we experimented with at University of Miami. I worked closely with Nathan Timpano. He's the chair of the art and art history department. And we sort of had two approaches here. We ended up settling on the second approach, which I'll talk about in a few moments. But the first approach, when we were brainstorming, you know, what are we going to do here? It was really about experimentation. It wasn't a finalized project, and it wasn't really fully thought through. The idea was sort of, let's use it like a sandbox. Let's get dirty and see what happens and understand people's interest and knowledge level of these tools. So it was to use AI to generate detailed visual descriptions of artworks, and then feed that visual description back in and see what the system would bring about. So I'll show you a few examples of those. I just want to credit the work done by the National Museum of Art, their project called Act as If You're a Curator. That work inspired what we were doing, experimenting at the Low. So for those of you who are not aware of that project, I strongly suggest you check it out. It's really fascinating. But long story short, they ended up making a data set of 14,000 objects that were machine readable and understandable by OpenAI's ChatGPT platform, and they ended up utilizing the system to suggest exhibition content, design, and text. So going back to what we did, this is on the left, a work of art from the Low Art Museum. I asked the system for a detailed visual description. Again, why it gave it to me in this outline format as opposed to a paragraph, completely unknown to me. But what I did was I took this visual description and fed it back in and said, you know, make an image, generate an image based on this visual description. So on the right is what the system ended up generating. It was clear that the system really had trouble understanding that that was a dog. It did seem to understand that the dog was wearing a shirt with a floral pattern on it and really took off on that. So this was a surprise and an interesting challenge that emerged. These were two other iterations that the system generated based on that visual description. I decided to obviously try this with another work of art from the Low. I was specifically choosing works of art that I thought could already look like an AI-generated image. So this is another piece from the Low Art Museum. I asked it for the visual description, and it was much closer in this case. So you can see the original work on the left and the AI-generated work on the right. These are two other iterations of that. Again, kind of fascinating. I'm going to try to run through this pretty quick. This was another image that I worked on, and I was thinking about how AI could develop labels for a theoretical exhibition. So I asked it for a visual description, and label content. So the top section is really the visual description, and the bottom section is this kind of label content. And for me, it was kind of fascinating. So I'll just read this quickly. The bottom half. This artwork captures a moment frozen in time, evoking both wonder and mystery. The meticulous composition and use of color draw viewers into a narrative that transcends the ordinary. Through Crewdson's lens, the everyday becomes extraordinary, inviting us to explore the hidden stories within our surrounding. So, I mean, I find that text somewhat meaningless. It's all of these broad strokes, but I've seen language like that utilized over and over in museums and online and in magazines. And so it was just interesting to me to see how it would approach doing some type of authoritative interpretive label generation. So just quickly, you can see on the right, utilizing the visual description section, something that it generated. If you look at the original on the left, there's a ladder and a water tower. It didn't seem to recognize or think those elements were important. So in the end, I adjusted, iterated on the prompt, and I said within the AI's visual description, you can see a water tower and a ladder in the background. And then I asked it to generate a new image. So these were the newer iterations based on that adjustment. So again, you constantly need to massage these prompts to figure out what you need. So the second and last case study was where this exhibition idea landed, which was called Fool Me Once. So it's an interactive art exhibition that juxtaposes reproductions of analog objects from permanent collection at the low and images that were created by ImageFX, which is Google's AI image generator. The idea was to explore the nuances of visual perception, inviting viewers to question the ethics of authenticity and use of appropriation in the art world. We also had the AI system edit the curator's text. And so we put up both text, and we actually ended up asking people to try to figure out which was human generated and which was AI generated. So I apologize for the poor quality of this photo, but this gives you an example of some of the artworks that were on the wall, some of the objects from the collection, some of the AI generated stuff. So just sharing quickly, I know the time is marching on, but these were the ImageFX and the prompts that were used in ImageFX. So the image on the left is from the Lowe's collection. Image on the right was generated by AI. I was just doing some comparisons between ImageFX and Copilot. So with this relatively simple prompt, I was able to get this iteration. So the original on the left and the AI generated on the right. And so again, you can see in the exhibition, the image on the left and then the one on the right. I find the image on the left, something interesting just to note is that the hand on the small Jesus figure and the male figure on the bottom right corner, their fingers are so elongated. This is this common mistake that you'll actually often see in AI. So it ended up offering this confusing element for when people were trying to figure out which was human and which was not human generated artwork. Just another example of differentiation between Copilot, ImageFX. This is how it dealt with abstract works of art. I actually, over time, forgot which one of these was from the Lowe's collection and had to go back to my colleague to get confirmation. I actually thought at one point that the one on the left was the one that was AI generated. And the reason being is that there are these paint drips that go up and paint drips that go down. So I said to myself, well, the AI system must be, just forgetting about ideas of gravity and doing that, as if an artist could not turn a work of art upside down to, get this drip effect. But in reality, so the image on the right is the AI generated one, which I thought was pretty impressive, mostly from the standpoint of how it alludes to the texture on the canvas of that piece. Anyway, so for me, seeing some really convincing and some not very convincing image generation based on these prompts. I think that's the last one. And so here, I won't read through all this text, but on the left, you have what was written by my colleague Nathan Timpano, and on the right, the sort of edited text using the prompt that's above. So use Strunk and White style guidelines on this text. This is a prompt I learned from a New York Times article, Strunk and White style guidelines really quite good for making things extremely concise and well structured. So it's a prompt I've often been using now to edit my own writing. Anyway, I've put in bold here where it's really done some changes, but I can just read, I'll read part of the last sentence so you get a sense. So from Renaissance prints to digitally constructed imagery, the exhibition endeavors to provoke reconsideration of our perceptions of human creativity. That's written by my colleague. Edited by AI. From Renaissance prints to digitally constructed images, Fool Me One seeks to challenge our understanding of human creativity, originality, and the future of visual culture. So just like a slight difference there, I do feel like what the AI did isn't well, I can't presume to know its motives, but for me, from an analysis, it does make the language slightly more accessible and less leaning towards art or art jargon, but not convinced that the change is it's better or worse. It's really about a differentiation. So in conclusion, what we did with this was we had a survey. So there was a QR code. Students or, well, whomever visited would conduct a survey then. And the survey was pretty straightforward. It would ask which one they thought was human generated, which one they thought was AI generated. We asked questions such what influenced their perception of the artwork and why they thought it might be AI or human. But we also started to ask some ethical questions, right? So how important do you think it is for artists and institutions to acknowledge the role of AI in the creation of artworks? Do you think the use of AI in art creation raises concerns about originality, authenticity? Should there be regulations or guidelines in place for the creation and display of AI-generated work? So this exhibition is actually up through December, and the university is still collecting data, and I hope to reach back out at this point to do some data analysis and see where things landed in terms of that project. So to close out, and then we'll open up for any Q&A, I just want to share some cool ideas that I have come across in the research I was doing for this webinar series. And I can promote working with Nick and Alex in that way, is that it was almost a form of professional development for me when I agreed to do a presentation that I didn't think I was really ready to do. So it really got me out there and continuously searching and thinking about AI in the broadest sense. So anyway, this is a really, to me, a fascinating project that the Norway National Museum is doing, that they're calling Semantic Search in an online collection. So to be really brief, what they're really doing here is that they utilize OpenAI's ChatGPT-4 Vision API for image analysis and detailed descriptive text generation. So really fancy way of saying they're using it to develop visual descriptions of the works of art. They're then taking that information and making it part of the metadata that can then be part of the discovery process for people looking at works of art. So from their opinion and their perspective, this enables users to explore and connect with artworks in unprecedented ways and in almost any language, but also in ways that they think are a bit more intuitive. So just a really interesting project of utilizing AI. For me, this is almost like an extension of something I'm thinking about in terms of the work with visual descriptions. I'd love to see how it could become part of our metadata and part of the discovery process in our collections management system. I also recently came across the London Museum. They have a new website and they've sort of rebranded themselves. They've used AI to create alt text for all of the objects in their collections online so that images are accessible to users. They used OpenAI's Whisper service to generate descriptive text and contextualize it, applying inclusive language. They also use a solution called Yake, along with AI powered by OpenAI, to generate topical and contextual relationships between stories and objects to supplement editorially curated relationships. And they've also used AI to explore what they call lateral relationships. So they really wanted to move away. Like if you're looking at a coin, that's what the illustration on the left is, you're going to see other coins, but rather what's the content of the coin? Who is that on the coin? And so the type of information that may pop up would be more just a lot broader in context and a lot more, you could say, I guess, interdisciplinary. So just, again, a really interesting approach to incorporating AI into collections management, data management, and also discoverability. So for me at the Wolfsonian moving forward, I'm definitely interested in exploring that semantic search. interested in generating or enhancing metadata for collection items, and definitely interested in multilingual support and the role that AI can do there. And to close out, I'll just always need to mention challenges and risks. So came across this chart that sort of lists ones that I think that we're all aware of: biased outputs, transparency, accountability. Some of the challenges we need to think about in terms of museums is the need for skilled human oversight, moderation, and resources to train AI, a scarcity of in-house expertise, the cost of implementation. Other risks are the race to release, right? Doing things too fast, harmful or malicious content, and underprepared users who don't understand or how to utilize these systems. I also just read this article, I think it was last week, that talked about some of the challenges related to AI models and for them to have access to and get trained on information. So you're seeing websites now restricting large swaths of content from data sets. This could lead to what could constitute an emerging crisis in data consent. So this article mentioned in the past year, around 25% of data from high quality sources has been restricted from major data sets used to train AI models. And this was a little scary, this bottom note. So to unlock new data, OpenAI is considered using Whisper, its speech recognition tool, to transcribe video and audio from websites like YouTube. So it's sort of like this war to work around and figure out how can we continue to devour data for free. This was also an article I read in the past week. So some other challenges is the potential of artificial intelligence become addictive for individuals to form emotional attachments to chatbots is becoming increasingly real. OpenAI's GPT-4 features more emotive voices. It says users are likely to develop deeper connections with these digital companions, and they've run some studies where they've seen this happen already. So this is just a concern. And then I came across this interesting statistic, which is that ChatGPT, over 1 million ChatGPT interaction logs found that sexual role-playing was one of the second most common use of the chatbot. So the point being there, not to be salacious, but how people are using these systems, not always on an intellectual basis or tied to their work. Okay, so last reflections here, just going back to this document that I mentioned earlier, which was Designing for Education with Artificial Intelligence, Essential Guide for Developers. This was released in July from the Department of Education. I just appreciated this idea. So it's the idea of building in a responsibility stack, right, to your innovation stack. When you're developing projects, you could see on the right the illustration they have. So these, just in general, figuring out and thinking about the morals and ethics of what's happening and the changes that are happening and how to build them into our work process. So I just sort of appreciated this approach and bringing it up. And in summary, right, the use of AI in art and other areas of creation raises profound ethical questions about authorship, ownership, and the nature of creativity. For me, I'm most interested in how do we create a tool to amplify our abilities and not replace them. And that was exhausting. But that'll close me.
Bravo, Mark. Thank you
You.
so much. That was a fantastic presentation. And sharing all of your experiences, talking about your prompt work. This has been fantastic. So we'll go ahead and take questions from the audience. While folks are typing out their questions, because I don't see any in the Q&A yet, I'll start off with some questions that were submitted when folks had registered for the webinar. So first up, this is fairly relevant to what you were talking about in your presentation, Mark. This person asked, should we and this is coming from an international individual, should we as an international cultural heritage sector develop shared open freeware for AI solutions for digitization, quality management, authenticity verification, collections management, image tagging and keywording using shared ontologies?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think that should absolutely be done. How that's done is such a complex thing, but it gets to the heart of even what I'm trying to do on a small scale and some of the things I shared of how do we standardize the process of what we're doing, right? So that we can also talk to each other in a way that, do comparatives, because if we're all sort of all over the place and approaching it from different ways and utilizing different methodologies, it really becomes difficult, I think, to both reflect and improve upon our practices. So I personally am a huge advocate of that idea of a consortium getting together and figuring out ways that cultural heritage sites and museums and artists, et cetera, can sort of work together and figure out at least some set of standards.
Absolutely. All right, so we've got a couple questions that have been submitted from Francis. What are the implications of copyright and intellectual property for AI generated art?
Well, that's a great question. I wish I knew I could answer that better. I can say there are an assortment of class action lawsuits out there being done by artists who are aware that some of the data sets that these systems have been trained upon have utilized their artworks, and there are examples of people using prompts where it'll say something akin to, please generate a work of art that's similar to the style of Mark Osterman, or even attempting to create a copy of an existing artwork. So this is just a larger problem related to rights and reproductions and that issue of how these systems have been trained. I think it's highly problematic. I mean, from my perspective, and as a practicing artist, we must get to this place where there is some credit and some control. But I do understand this argument where I'm not a huge advocate for AI, even though I did this presentation, but when I think about how I learn, right, and how I make my art, and even what I shared, right, I'm scrubbing the internet for images. I am creating something new because I'm combining these things in ways that have never been done before. But everything I know is built upon something that already exists. So like this becomes this argument, right? That this is how humans have been learning the entire time. You read a book and then you're influenced by a book. But if an AI system is then taking a book as part of the data set it's using to learn, this is a copyright and rights and reproductions issue, which I agree it is. But there is something complex about that argument. I like so many things. There's a lot of gray in there, but I absolutely advocate for and think it's important to have rights and reproductions and copyright for people who are generating content, because the reality is not just about money, but the idea of credit, right? Like we start to lose the motivational principle if like we just absolutely are not credited for the things we do that are innovative and impactful to the world around us.
Absolutely. I think we're going to start seeing a lot more, as you mentioned, Mark, citations for use of AI. Maybe not necessarily in image generation yet, but definitely in papers and things like that. So we had another question that was put in the chat. Did you look into how AI can encourage emotional intelligence? Most people think this is the one area where AI falls short now and may never be able to exhibit. This is a great question. Thank you, Robin.
It's a great question. I can't really speak to it. No, I haven't. I was just reading an article yesterday in the New York Times about AI in schools. It was focused on middle school students and teachers. It was actually really focused on how teachers are trying to deal with AI, but how the students are utilizing it. But it also related to less about their emotional intelligence, but the idea of that. So with technology, right, we have this problem where we expect everything immediately. So we want immediate gratification, right? This idea of stalling gratification is really falling outside the realm of normal behavior. So this teacher was ruminating how she's identified over the past 7 years, she thinks like students get frustrated quicker in terms of learning something because they actually have the expectation that they should learn something right away. And so their reliance upon something like AI is becoming problematic in that area because they give up really fast, which I thought it was interesting. I know that's sort of tangential to the emotional intelligence question, but just slightly related.
No, I think that is a really interesting Mark, that's a really interesting point. I have a child who's in school, so that's certainly something that I see from, a parental perspective, not necessarily a professional one. But we don't have any other questions from the audience yet, but I do have some other questions that were submitted. Um, so one question, how can we deploy AI fast and be cost aware in our museums? And they used AI pretty generally. So do with that as
So
you will.
yeah, so as I said, I don't have a concrete answer for that. And I explained with the caveat that I'm at an institution that I do have a Microsoft Office 365 account that gives me access to Copilot, which, basically has this kind of image recognition. So the projects that I, showed, the exhibition project, we probably spent, I think we had a budget of like $1,500,
Mm.
but the visual description project, I incorporated into my work. I was head of digital experiences at the Low Art Museum, and experimenting and innovating with AI and collections management was just part of what I was doing. So, in terms of, it's really about scalability. So the realm I'm working is very small, right? So like I did visual descriptions, like I said, for maybe 75 works of art. In the end, I'll need a budget, right, to work and think about, well, how will I get to, because for example, the Wolfsonian has over 200,000 objects in its collection. The Low Art Museum had about 20,000. But dealing with that scalability, that's when I need funds allocated either directly from the institution or looking for opportunities that could be grant funded or from foundations. But I do think doing smaller projects like I've given case examples of, they give you the ability to make the case. Look, here's the proof of concept done, but now I need 10, 20, $50,000 to scale this project up and have real impact. So that's my suggestion.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that, Mark. So we got another question submitted. As a public art gallery working with living artists, we are very concerned with feeding artists' work into generative AI. Can you speak to artist rights and how we can protect them?
Well, what I think is it's a real concern. I don't know how to protect them, and I don't think anyone does yet. And so that's why this is going through the court systems now to establish better guidelines related to rights, reproductions, copyright. I think it goes back to that original question of, it was broader, but it should obviously be part of that idea of like, should there be a consortium that, is representative of how we're employing AI, in sort of the creative arts industries. A lot of this is coming up in music generation, and there's just these immense battles happening there related to that, and it hasn't been figured out either. And so I wish I had a more cogent or coherent answer to that. But it's ongoing. I think one of the biggest problems and challenges is that all this technology just went out the gate. It's like we're all trying to catch up. And that's a problem.
Definitely. Jim and Robin in the chat have also touched on something really important here too. Jim said, I hadn't considered this until I saw some research on it. The carbon footprint of AI is surprising. It requires the same energy to generate one image as it does to fully charge a smartphone. Wow. That's also something I hadn't considered. He said MIT study was used as an example. And Robin asked, how do we as global society solve this? I know that expands beyond just us as a cultural heritage community, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so again, would not have an answer to that, but I think that it's so important that it was brought up. I think what I hope originally one of my slides went under risks and challenges. It originally had sustainability there, but to the participants' point, I should have actually elevated that and mentioned it because that's one way, right? That it's constantly spoken about, so it can be advocated for and looked at as an important challenge that needs to be mitigated as opposed to something that's on the back burner and an
Mhm.
afterthought. So right now, I don't think it's elevated enough in the conversation. And I'm guilty of of doing that in my presentation. So good point.
Yeah. agreed on both the guilty part and that we need to elevate that point a lot more. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Mark, for your time. This was a fabulous presentation. Thank you, everyone who joined in and, to listen and ask these really important questions. We'll be back next month with webinars for hedonics and Indulge Me. I'm going to put the Zoom registration links in the chat if you want to check out information on those webinars. Please follow us on our social media channels to stay up to date on BPOC activities, including announcements for future webinars. Thank you again, everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.